Friend, enemy, or frenemy? How do Indians view the rise of China and its implications for India's rise? Join the conversation on this important topic by taking the China Challenge survey. The survey has been put together by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. Answer our 10 simple questions and let your voice be heard in shaping India's policy towards China. For more details, log on to www.takshashila.org.in or you can click on the link and take the survey in the show notes. Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. My name is Shambhavi, and today I have with my colleague Saurabh. Hey, Saurabh.
Hi, Shambhavi. Happy to be here.
Saurabh and I are going to be discussing something very interesting today, which is the ethical concerns with regards to the deployment of synthetic biology. Now, you might wonder what is synthetic biology, and to be honest, I think around the world everybody wonders what is synthetic biology, because there is no definition that the world could agree to. Right? There are multiple technologies that fall in this field. The most common, the most popular, and I think the most spoken about, at least on the All Things Policy podcast, is gene editing. Right? So genetic engineering is a form of altering organisms, but can also be used to create new novel organisms. Right? So the word synthetic, I think, to some extent, is not artificial in the way of thinking of plastics, but it is more so about humans creating novel life. So that is quite interesting. There are other technologies, there are biomaterials that people are playing with. There is actual gene synthesis, not just editing. And it is estimated that I think about 40% of the world's GDP is sooner or later going to be controlled by synthetic biology, which is quite fascinating. I mean, when you think of bioplastics replacing all of our plastic requirements, I think in a utopian world, we would probably have energy creating organisms and we'll switch from petrol to using these organisms to create energy, right? And run the world in a more cleaner manner. So it offers really interesting opportunities. But as is always with any new technology that helps humans control nature itself, it brings up a lot of issues. And today we're going to discuss very briefly about the opportunities, but mostly about the ethical concerns of synthetic biology and how we can mitigate them. So welcome, Saurabh. Saurabh, what do you think first of the opportunity of synthetic biology?
Yeah. So thanks, Shambhavi. I mean, synbio or synthetic biology is, this field, as you said, holds a lot of promise. And when you say 30, 40% or up to 50% of global GDP being replaced by products linked to synbio, I mean, almost, I think, 20, 30 trillion US dollars. So that is a significant economic impact. I think the opportunities with synbio are immense. So they could range from, creating bioplastics or microbes to eat plastic waste, bioremediation, creating more climate resilient crops, to, impacting, let's say, humans much more significantly by developing medical techniques to, cure a lot of disorders and diseases, especially the ones which are genetic in nature and that we have not been able to address by now. Then you can go into, like something more, some more aspects of synbio which we may not think of, using like a more bio-friendly cement in construction, or artificial meat to reduce the carbon footprint of cultivation of meat. So I mean, the opportunities are there, but as you've mentioned and we will discuss, is that given the impact of synbio and its applications are going to be this immense, it is all the more important to ensure that these applications are resorted to in a manner which is ethical, at the same time involves, uh, a whole kind of a broad based approach to public consultation, because every single person would be impacted by these applications, either directly or indirectly. So it is very, very important to make sure that the ethics of SynBio are also taken care of.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, look at gene editing, which is probably the topic that I have studied the most in terms of governance. The first ethical concern that has been raised globally is: are we playing God? Right? Are we doing? Is this giving ourselves too much power at changing nature? We saw very recently with the Supreme Court judgment on GM mustard as well, right? Is there a compelling reason for us to be tampering with nature? Are we doing too much, etc.? That keeps on coming up now and again. And I think there have been justifications of this before, that this might arise because of scientific illiteracy. There have been papers that suggest that because people don't know the science, they don't understand how we can use it, and they might feel as if we are transgressing nature or playing God. But that belief is pretty strong among a lot of people. And we see that being reflected in global policies when it comes to gene editing. The EU, for example, has a very risk-averse policy where they ban genetically modified food. Editing of babies is obviously banned across the world. Is that true for an Indian context? What do you think?
To be honest, I don't know. I think I mean, the only kind of parallel I can think of is that like the GM crops debate in India, where there is support for those crops among farmers, which will be the users, but there is a huge opposition, at least from the environmentalists or even some economists, by saying, like, you are depending on a technology which would make you dependent on a foreign company. So that's one kind of debate where I feel like there is a public scientific world dichotomy. So the science, I mean, as far as I see it, it is pretty established that GM crops are more or less safe. I mean, we have been using them for decades now. But for gene editing, I would think that people are probably going to be scared about it.
But it's quite interesting because we did at Takshashila, we did a small survey a few years ago. But very recently, there has been a survey that the Pew Research Center has done across the globe. They did a similar survey looking at perceptions of gene editing in US citizens. That was, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, where they first showed that despite the US government's and US scientists' strong aversion to using gene editing for babies, US citizens were surprisingly pro gene editing, especially if the gene editing therapy was going to either prevent a disease that would kill the baby, or it would reduce the chances of a very grave disease, right? People weren't very excited if you're going to use gene editing for enhancement, for making the baby intelligent, for example. When they did that same survey in India, though, about 56% of Indians said that gene editing is medically acceptable, right? That it is fine to do genetically editing babies across the spectrum, across when you're actually rectifying disease, or even if you're making the baby intelligent. And it was the only country that they surveyed, I think 20 countries or so across Asia, across the world, sorry. And India was the only country where they found that pattern, where we seem to be okay with using gene editing for any purpose. So I suppose this argument of playing God is not really going to interfere with the adoption of synthetic biology technologies. I think the problems are so deep rooted that solutions are really required. And as long as the solutions are safe and proven safe in a transparent manner, I think the Indian public is going to be on board with adopting those. Yeah, I find it very interesting that the GM debate, right? For example, in India, we see pro as well as anti-GM groups. In China, on the other hand, from what I understand, a lot of public perception is that GM is not required and not wanted. However, their government has decided that GM is something that is required for nutritional sufficiency, has really pushed for GM crops, and we see a lot of them being approved. Very recently, they approved GM soya in a first to kind of reduce their foreign dependence on Brazil and America to get soya. So for them, it is the national security which seems to be guiding their decisions on embracing emerging technologies. In India, I think From what the data shows so far, perhaps the Indian public is ready to accept solutions. I mean, I have spoken to a number of patient groups, for example, when we were working on gene editing, right? And they are really, I mean, when someone you love is suffering, you don't really think about, is this playing God? Is this too much? You want that person to feel better, right? And so the ethical concerns are really different for the person who suffers than for the person who doesn't. And it seems Indians are on board with that idea that let us get people out of suffering and not worry about what the technology underlying is doing too much.
Yeah, and honestly, I think that's a bit surprising in a way, in a sense, because you would think that, oh, it is such an advanced technology, it would require a lot of, like public acceptance, public knowledge. But we again see this dichotomy between, like the public being maybe a bit more accepting of the technology in general, but the scientists or maybe the policymakers or regulators being a bit more cautious. So that kind of brings me to the other point, is that while the public may be broadly accepting of the technology, but are they accepting of different aspects of how that technology is going to be implemented? So for example, how are you going to govern something like, how to implement and monitor and regulate applications regarding synthetic biology? So do you have any ideas on that, like how can we do this regulation where the technology is very fast evolving, there is a lot of moving parts, and the applications have dual use, for example, right? So how to go about that without stifling innovation, because just banning it is the easiest way to go, but I don't think that is the correct way to go.
Yeah, I think one of the concerns that we have, and this might not be unique to India. I mean, we have recently spoken to a lot of representatives from other Southeast Asian countries, right? And we see this concern reflecting again and again, is that the bureaucratic capacity to assess a lot of these applications is missing. I mean, when you have a technology that can be used everything from bacteria to seafood to animals to trees to humans to babies, I mean, how can you possibly sit and put that, create one single framework to regulate that? That's never going to happen. The cost to benefit for different applications is going to be different. The dual use nature is going to differ by application, and it is quite obvious that we might not have enough capacity to a assess and b actually monitor and enforce regulation. I mean, I think a classic example is the mushrooming of all the stem cell clinics, right, across India. Once stem cell technology became popular, although India doesn't allow the commercial use of stem cells beyond hematopoietic stem cells, but we see hair transplants, we see cancer, we see diabetes clinics all around where stem cells are supposedly curing all of these diseases, which is not allowed. Right? They can only work in clinical trial mode technically, but there is really no bureaucratic capacity to kind of ensure that the guidelines are being met. So how do we try to kind of focus bureaucratic capacity into what is required? I think the easy way to do is try to AC where is the most benefit and least harm, right? Least risk. We, for example, had very recently, I think we had changes to the drug laws, which said that if drugs are approved in 5 countries, I think US, UK, EU, Japan, and Australia, then they don't need to do clinical trials in India. Then this is for, yeah, and this is for new drugs, which so that people in India can have access, quicker access to these drugs, even as otherwise we used to have phase 3 clinical trials had to happen in India before we gave the drug elsewhere to Indians. So for rare diseases, etc., gene therapies, this new thing has been coming. We have to wait and see how well this works, because especially for gene therapies, because the genetic composition of Indians is unique, it's different from the other populations. And so if we will have to see whether that removal of clinical trials for gene therapies will actually be of any help. But that is one way of actually, I think, lessening the bureaucratic hurdles that people have to face in accessing drugs, right? And that's one way of assessing what is of highest benefit. So there are other countries which have assessed the benefit of applications and the risks, and we're going to kind of use that data for our own good, which is a nice strategy. The problem there is that obviously we are they're not doing research on our own, which is something that we want to promote, right? So A, I think, is to just build that bureaucratic capacity. I think the academic sector can really help with the assessing of some of these applications, assessing the need of applications to begin with. That would be helpful. The other, I think, is awareness about consent. I think that is very important when it comes to synthetic biology. I mean, when you have applications such as one of the concerns with genetically edited babies that has been raised in other countries, not so much in India, is we don't have consent of future generations to do this. That's one application which is, which we can never really solve. If we go down that quagmire of will we be able to get consent from future generations, that's just unsolvable. But there are other which are more problematic but can potentially be solved. For example, genetically edited mosquitoes for elevating dengue, which is not a person individual level consent, but a community level consent. So, how do you actually navigate that? What is informed consent and what is community agreement in that case, right? Because if I don't agree to a genetically edited mosquito being released in my vicinity, then but if majority people do and the local government does, the only option I really have is to move from here, which is, I mean, and I don't know how far because mosquitoes can very easily travel. But anyways, these are likely to be caged mosquitoes even if released. But anyways, you get the point, right? So that's one. So there's a future generation. There is the community level consent required, and the third is actually individual consents, right? So GMOs, for example, if I don't feel like eating a GMO plant product, but there's a label that says that this is GM or non-GM, I can individually have the agency to choose something or not. So basically, how do we then start navigating consent? How do we build mechanisms to ensure that proper consent for the impact of the application is taken? I think it's going to be a really important way in building public trust in synthetic biology technology. I think consent is going to be an important ethical concern that we need to work around. What do you think, sir?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, uh, like, I was just thinking that regarding all these new technologies where a lot of, public data is involved, either personal data or a user data, or in some context, consent is the very, the bedrock of these regulations, right? So you have to consent to Google or Facebook or Instagram or Twitter to use your data for their algorithms, to do some targeted advertisements, right? When you go to a hospital, when you have data, when they collect your data, you consent to give that data to, let's say, researchers for medical research or something else. So consent is pretty much, built in. But I am curious to kind of see if that model is going to still work, because one example that I can think of is that with the new large language models that are coming, I mean, chat gpt and is something that we all know and are familiar with, but there are, specific topic level llms that are also being developed by companies. So let's say some models, are exclusively being trained on, let's say, patient data or like research papers, to then maybe figure out, some like novel invention or discovery can be made using those models. In that case, how would consent work? So if I consented to use my data to, let's say, I don't know, research on muscular dystrophy, and that data set is being, fed into some model, and it brings out something else that is linked to, let's say, malaria. How do you, square that circle? I didn't consent my data being used for research on malaria, but the model is multi-purpose, right? I mean, it's a model, you can use it however you want, and once model learns something from my data, it is very difficult to like unlearn it in the way that we may think. So now if I decide to, what, maybe I don't want my data to be used for research at all, and if I withdraw that consent, that is not going to work at all, or we're just gonna, like, fill paperwork by assuming that this works, and it will be all a charade. So with new technologies, new data processing, AI and LLMs, I'm not sure if the consent thing works in this case. And I'm not even going into the idea where people don't even know what they are consenting for. Do they have the ability to know, what the research will be used for. And this is not to say, people are stupid, like only scientists know stuff how to do, but in general, because the fields are so kind of dynamic, you don't know what you're researching, or like what you may stumble upon while researching. So how can you get a informed consent in that case? I don't know, I'm a bit rambling here, but
No, no, no. I think if I understand the gist of what you are saying. And I think we are asking more and more open ended questions of databases because we can now have access to so much data, as in we, I mean, scientists. And that's the beauty of science, right? When you have a database, you don't want to go with a hypothesis. You want to ask open ended questions and see and identify patterns that were not visible before. Because now you have the large enough data sets, and B, the computing power to actually ask those queries. I think the workaround around about that most people use is saying that we are consenting to research in for some therapy, right, and not limiting to what disease type, etc. This kind of also, I mean, this has been I think a deep ethical concern, not related only to synthetic biology, but the use of any human data. This is biological data, because a lot of consent forms will usually say we are using this for research. It implies that the research is well intentioned. There is obviously a patient doctor dynamic there, where I think this is true for many Indians. If your doctor tells you that this is for the good, let us do it, people will do it. I think a classic case is the number of stem cord centers that we have, right, that keep placenta cells, despite the fact that we have very few therapies where that cord blood is actually going to be used, but it seems to be beneficial. And if your doctor tells you, hey, you should do this, then probably a lot of people will do it anyways, right? So that's I think that power dynamics plays to it a bit. Also, I mean, I'm not justifying whether this is a good idea, because it can very easily be abused, right? People can say that we're taking it for research, and use it for research that is not aligned with maybe the personal values of the donors themselves, but the donors at that point do not really realize what research constitutes. And this, I think, is going to be very interesting because, again, if you take the example of genetically edited babies, right? Individuals might be very keen gene editing for adults and might be happy giving their samples away for research on gene editing in adults, but might actually have personally be uncomfortable with genetically edited babies and might not want their data to be used for that, right? So, to what degree of nuance do we need to go? Is informed consent really that critical when we are looking at very large data sets that, where the samples is probably going to be anonymous? I think that's one thing that all of these large data sets are hinged on. Is the ethics of one person more important than the benefit of the society? I mean, there are very interesting questions that are being raised just because of the new technologies that are now coming to fore. How should we use people's data constructively? And because it's really necessary that, I mean, all of these nice things that we're talking about only work when we have really large data sets, right, across billions of people or billions of organisms, uh, to be able to see those unique patterns that can help us find the most interesting solutions. So it's going to be a conundrum. How do you do all of this while respecting the individual, while respecting national boundaries and national laws, especially if there is international data sharing, countries trying to protect their own biosovereignty, trying to prioritize their companies into getting, into making solutions and not sharing data, etc. So I think, yeah, I think this is going to be a very, very interesting time in for both science and geopolitics.
I completely agree. And I'm just wondering, like, with this, I mean, this one example that where we can maybe look back to is the experience during COVID. I mean, again, COVID is an outlier, right? So I think trying to extract very deep insights about how we all may work in a non-pandemic situation may not be the best way. But when we were at the start of the crisis, right, everybody was, more or less trying to, come up with like a vaccine for it. There was a much fuller and freer exchange of sequences, and there was a lot more cooperation. But once the vaccine was made, or at least like a few concrete steps were being made towards that, then the world very quickly split into groups, like this is my vaccine, this is your vaccine, mine is good, yours is bad. And then once that kind of settled down, you then had much more deeper questions regarding what kind of research you should do. Should you do the gain of function research, right? Should you do the loss of function research? Who should regulate it? Should countries do that? And if something happens with your data or your funding in some other country, are you liable? I mean, all of these questions, especially in the US China context, were very pertinent. So I'm just wondering that with all of these opportunities and data sets and everything, does this also lead to a much more closed system where now you may be willing to safeguard your data by not sharing it, and maybe trying to be a bit more independent in how to use your data? So that might stifle innovation and research. But is the field, or do you think the synbio field is at risk of, or is already becoming too securitized?
I think data is being securitized, right? And that might lead to problems. But I think overall scientists are also seeing the benefits of sharing data. And I think at some point of time, a compromise has to be made on how to share data more effectively. We know the Convention on Biological Diversity, for example, doesn't really work in the Southeast Asian context, also in the Indian context, because we don't find it to be fair. Also, the US hasn't signed it, which is, I mean, for me, is the most interesting part of the convention. Um, and so I think there's a need to revisit that benefit sharing. I mean, there's the fear of someone else coming and accessing our data and then reselling us products based on that data at a much higher cost is quite valid. And that needs to be addressed. There are privacy concerns which obviously need to be taken seriously. But I think if we can solve for those two, we can urge people to share more data. And this is people, organisms, plants, etc. Right? So I think it's possible. It isn't rocket science, and I think we should be able to do it fairly soon.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think these are quite open ended questions, right? I mean, there are no easy answers, and as you said initially, we don't even agree on what is synbio. It's even the definition. If you can't agree on what something is, it's very hard to regulate it. It's very hard to come to a common understanding of how countries should approach it. So I think as the field is evolving, as new and new applications are being developed, as they are being like uh, brought into the market, I think these discussions are going to gain steam, and I think at some point, some sort of a at least bare minimum basic understanding and agreement on what it is and how to regulate and what is the ethics of it would needs to be developed. I mean, there are many frameworks already there, but they are a bit more disparate and don't have as broader acceptance as we would like them to be, both in terms of capacity and in terms of their actual implementation.
Yeah, I agree. And I think a lot of this also comes from, again, the idea that a lot of these frameworks were created in the global north, and that people and countries in other parts of the world feel left behind, and that those frameworks might not be very inclusive or relevant to them. So the requirement for a more inclusive framework, I think, is really necessary. But you're right. I think this is just going to be a first in a series of conversations between you and me as the field evolves to see where we are going, how we can do this better. There's going to be ups and downs, but I think this is going to be fun. This is very exciting field, and I hope that India does its best to take leadership position in this emerging field. I think with that, yeah, thanks Saurabh for this conversation. Thank you everybody for listening. I thought it was fun. If you have any comments, to reach out to us. Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at TakshashilaInst or our website takshashila.org.in.